Good day, ma'am. My name is Rostan from the College of Criminology, 3rd year, Section C. Number 1. Rhythm line quality. Does the question writing have a skillful, rhythmic, free-flowing appearance? A. Smooth, free-glowing. B. Shaky. Nervous, wavering. Number C. Deliberate. Number 2. Irregularities. Does the question writing have an awkward, unnatural, sloppy appearance? A. Evidence of patching and or retouching. B. Evidence of foreign marks made by the writing instrument. C. Broken connecting strokes. D. Circle formations made up of separate strokes. E. Pen lifts and separations. F. Vertical strokes and slanted strokes combination. G. Individualized irregularities not an indication of forgery. Number 3. Size and proportion. What is the height of the overall writing, the individual strokes, and the proportion to each other? A. Height of overall writing. B. Height of the short letters in proportion to the tall letters. C. Evidence of diminishing strokes. D. Evidence of increasing strokes. E. Narrow in proportion to height. F. Evidence of balancing above and below the baseline. G. The D and T stem heights are in the what proportion to other letters? H. Ill-formed strokes unskilled. Number 4. Alignment to baseline. What alignment exists to a ruled or imaginary baseline? Straight edge or ruler measurements should be made. A. Straight baseline pattern. B. The letter strokes leave the baseline. C. The word strokes leave the baseline. D. Concave baseline. E. Convex baseline. F. Upward slant. G. Downward slant. H. Angling slant. Number 5. Spacing. What are the spacing contained within the question writing? A check of the spaces between letters, words, lines, the edges of margins and paragraph indentation should be made. A. Left margin even. B. Left margin jog. C. Angle on the left margin. D. Angle on the right margin. E. Space between capital letters and small letters. Space, 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 space. F. Space between capital letters. G. Space between word formations. H. Connecting strokes spacing. I. Proportion of breaks and or spaces between letters. 6. Degree of slant. What is the degree of slant? The consistency and the comparison of questioned and known writings protractor measurement may be made. A. Right hand slant. B. Left hand slant. Number 7. Pen pressure. Weight. What is the general width of strokes in the writings? In addition, what amount of pressure was used in the making the strokes? Detailed measurement and examination with a stereoscope with reflected and transmitted light should be made. A. Light pressure. B. Heavy pressure. Medyo matampok. C. Medium pressure. Sakto la. Number 8. Placement of diacritics. How are the T-bars crossed, the I-dots dotted, and other punctuation marks applied? A. T-bar light crossing off. B. T-bar heavy crossing. C. T-bar short in proportion to stem. D. T-bar long in proportion to stem. E. T-bar location on the stem. The location. F. T-bar left of the stem. G. T-bar right of the stem. H. T-bar convex shaped. I. T-bar concave shaped. J. T-bar fades. K. T-bar constant. I. T-bar increases becomes heavier. M. T-bar slants in relation to the baseline. N. T-bar forms a hook at the initial or terminal end. O. T-bar tied around the stem. P. T-bar uncrossed. Q. I-dots slightly dotted. R. I-dots firm heavy dotted. S. I-dots location above the stem. T. I-dots left of stem. U. I-dots right of the stem. V. I-dots circle formation. W. I-dots jobbed. X. I-dots missing. Number 9. Strokes formation. Does the question writing contain sharp, needle-like stroke formations, wedge-shaped, flat-top strokes, or a combination of any or all of these strokes? An examination of common letters such as the M's, the N's, the R's, the P's, and the S may reveal stroke formation shapes. A. Needle-shaped. B. Wedge-shaped. C. Curved rounded shape. And D. Flat square shape. Number 10. Loop formations. How are the loop formations made and what are their relationship to other strokes in the writing? A. long loop formation. B. Short loop formation. C. Broad loop formation. D. Narrow loop formation. E. Needle-shaped loops. F. Wedge-shaped loops. And G. Rounded loops. H. Flat squared loops. I. Interspersed with another loop. J. Above baseline beginning strokes. Here's the baseline. K. Below baseline beginning strokes. The letters are below the baseline. I. Unusual loop formation. M. Clockwise formation. N. Counterclockwise formation. O. Unfinished. P. Tied around the stem. Q. Circle formation. R. Absence of loops, straight strokes. Number 11. Circle formations. A. Open. B. Closed. C. Broad. D. Narrow. And E. Filed. Number 12. Beginning and ending strokes. A. Hooked. B. Flourished or embellished. C. Inflexible straight upstrokes. D. Flexible curved upstroke. And E. Location on the staff. F. Above baseline location. Here's the baseline again. G. Below baseline location. H. Simple direct downstroke. I. Long running stroke. J. Heavy stroke. K. Light stroke. And I. Hooked. Letter M. Flourished, embellished. Letter N. Abrupt ending. O. Inflexible straightforward stroke. P. Flexible curved forward. Q. Above baseline ending. Adinira baseline. Edi, tas adin ending. R. Below baseline ending. Hadian baseline. Tas ang katapusan ng letters, paubos. S. Faded. T. Heavy. U. Blobbed. V. Patch. Different structures of letter design. Each individual has his own concept in constructing the letter of the alphabet. Therefore, there is a need for a definite procedure in handwriting analysis. Without a practical approach of analysis, many individual characteristics in handwriting may be overlooked. For those who have occasion to examine handwriting within a limited period of time, such as signature verifiers in banks and students of question documents, the following scheme of analysis may help. Number 1. Examination of small letter A. Examine the oval of each letter and note carefully any points on the circumference where there are deviations from absolute symmetry. Any bulges, flats, angles, or tremor, do this always show at one particular point. Here. B. Note the direction of major axis of each oval. Number C. Is each oval completely closed in its upper aspect, or is it there a general tendency to leave a tiny gap? D. Consider each oval as a clock face. Is the oval closed at 11, 12, or 1 o'clock? E. Is the closing stroke but end on the upper portion of the oval, or is it carried a little higher, leaving a tiny peep? Or does the overlap make a minute X? Here. F. Is initial upstroke present? Do this start from above the baseline, from the line, or from below it? Here's the baseline. G. Is there an eyelet formed where the initial upstroke meets the oval? H. Is there an eyelet formed in the process retracing the right bend aspect of the oval in downward direction? Is the retrace perfect? I. At what point does the downward retracing line leave below or above the baseline? Here is the baseline. Adi ko no. Letter J. To what height is terminal upstroke carried, and what angle? Letter K. If there is no terminal upstroke, how is the letter finished? Paano ko nung nag-end ang letter? Number 2. Examination of small letter B. A. Is there an initial upstroke or a bird? If so, where does it commence in relation to the baseline? What angles does it make with the letter? Is the stroke straight or concave to the right? Is there an initial hook? B. Are all loops symmetrical? Loops. Letter C. Are there blind loops? D. Which side of the loops shows maximum curvature? E. Is the staff straight or bowed? F. Is the throw symmetrical? Examine position of lowest position of throw in relation of the baseline. So here is the baseline again. Adi ko no. G. In completing the throw, How high is the upstroke carried? Examine this in relation to the overall height of the letter and the length of loop. Ang length ko no. H. Is the final portion of the upstroke parallel with the staff, diverging from it, or curving inward towards it? I. Is their final spar? Examine the length, direction. Length ko no handy. An end. J. Is there an eyelet at the junction or spar with the throw? Number 3. Examination of small letter C. A. Is there an initial upstroke? Does initial upstroke cut across the downward portion of main curve of letter? B. Does the main curve start with a thick point or an eyelet? Is there an initial spiral? C. Note the position of the lowest portion of the main curve in relation to the baseline. Main curve. D. Examine terminal upstrokes. How high is it carried? At what angle does it finish? Is its final position straight or curved? Does it finish as a terminal letter with increasing or decreasing stress? Number 4. Examination of small letter D. A. Does the staff in its upward travel intersect upper portion of the curve, leaving a minute projection on its right hand side? B. Are initial upstrokes present? Do these start above the baseline from the line or from below it? Here's the baseline. Hindi ko no. C. Is there an eyelet formed where the initial upstroke meets the oval? D. Is the staff looped or slightly curved to the other side? E. Is the staff straight or slightly curved to the other side? F. At what point does the downward retracing line leave the oval? Is there a terminal upstroke? If so, is this the throw above? F. At what point does the downward retracing line leave the oval? Is there a terminal upstroke? If so, is the trough above, on, or below the baseline? To what height is the terminal upstroke carried, and what angle? If no terminal upstroke, how is it finished? Number 5. Examination of small letter E. A. Examine development of curves in loop. Note which side of the loop is flatter. B. Note proportion of length of loop to width. Any instances of blind loop? C. At what point does initial upstroke commence? From commencement to loop intersection, is initial upstroke present? D. At point of intersection of loop, note carefully angles made by downstrokes and by initial upstroke with each other. With baseline, and with major axis of loop. E. Note height of intersection of loop above baseline. Here is the baseline po. Andi. F. Note height of lowest part of trough above baseline. G. Is there terminal upstroke? How is it carried? At what does it finish? Does it finish as terminal letter with increasing or decreasing stress? Increasing stress and decreasing stress. Number 6. Examination of small letter f. A. Does either loop show a tendency to become blind? B. Study upper loop as in the case of small b. Are all loops symmetrical? Are there blind loops? Which sides show maximum curvature? C. Is upper loop simplified to a bar? If so, is this a simple downstroke or is it a retraced upstroke? D. Is the upper portion a pointed formation, rounded, or eyelet? E. Is the upper portion a loop formed in the clockwise direction? F. Are upper and lower loops alternated on opposite sides of the stuff? G. Does the letter consist of a simple stuff carrying alternated hook or spiral at their end? Number 7. Examination of small letter G. A. Note proportion between overall height of oval and length of loop. Length. B. Examine the oval of each letter and note carefully any points on the circumference where there is deviation from absolute. C. Consider each oval closed at 11, 12, or 1 o'clock. D. Are initial upstrokes present? If so, do they start on above or below the baseline? E. When the letter occurs in the body of a word, does the initial upstroke undercut the oval? F. Does the initial upstroke form an eyelet with upper aspect of oval? G. At what point does a staff part from the oval? H. Examine lower loop as in the case of small letter P. Note dimension of width, length, symmetry, or curvature. Curve. I. Height of final upstroke carried. At what angle does it terminate? J. Is the lower loop simplified to a hook? Or is it first simplified to a hook? K. Is the loop simplified to a single downstroke? If so, note comparatively the length of stroke. Number 8. Examine of small letter H. A. Is there an initial upstroke? If so, note the position of starting upstrokes, straight and curved. What angle does it rise? B. Examine the loop as for small letter B. Examine for symmetry. Examine for symmetry. Proportion. Major axis. C. Does the letter commence with an upstroke which loops ground upon itself to form a large islet. E. Note the proportion of lower end of stop in relation to baseline. Lowest portion of garland termination. F. Examine final stroke if present as the length, curvature, and angle with baseline. G. Examine the symmetry of arc. Symmetry. Number 9. Examine of small letter I. A. Is there an initial upstroke? If so, examine in the manner already described. B. Is there a final stroke? If so, examine in the usual way. C. Does the downstroke retrace the initial upstroke, and if so, to what extent? Is there an islet formed at their junction? D. Examine the formation, location, and position of the eye dot. So here is the eye dots. So here are the hard eye dots. Number 10. Examine of small letter J. A. Is there an initial upstroke? If so, examine in the manner already described. B. Is there a final stroke? If so, examine already in the usual way. C. Determine the formation, location, and position of the dot. D. Examine the lower loop as for small letter G. Number 11. Examination of small letter K. A. Examine initial upstroke, loop, and stop as for letter H. B. Examine the number of strokes and the buckle knot. C. Examine the final stroke in the usual way. Number 12. Examination of small letter L. Follow the procedure laid down in the case of small letter E. Number 13. Number 13. Examination of small letter M. A. Examine initial upstrokes as to its length and start. Number 13. Examination of small letter M. A. Examine initial upstroke as to its length and starting point. B. Is there a terminal upstroke? If so, examine in the usual way. Letter C. Examine relative heights of the three arcs. D. Examine the first arc, whether rounded, angular, etc. E. Examine lower points of the feet of the later relation to the baseline. Hindi naman nira. Examination of small letter N. Examine as in the case of small letter M. Number 15, examination of small letter O. A. When the letter begins a word, is there an initial upstroke or a commencing horizontal stroke? B. Does the initial stroke form an eyelet with the oval? C. Is the base of an oval on, below, or above the baseline? D. At what point was the oval closed? Examination of small letter P. A. Examine initial upstrokes. If so, examine in the usual way. B. Is there an eyelet at the top of stop or any tendency? Ito. C. Examine the lower projection as to length, bulge, and retrace. D. Examine the central body as to formation. Examination of small letter Q. A. Examine upstroke, if any, in the oval as laid down in small letter G. B. Examine the lower projection as to length, bulge, point of intersection. C. In the base of the lower projection on angle or an arcade. Examine the final stroke the usual way. Number 18. Examination of small letter R. A. Examine initial upstroke. If present, examine the usual way. B. Examine the formation, height of the hump. C. Examine the final stroke. Examination of small letter S. A. Examine the initial stroke whether on or above or below the baseline. B. Is the initial straight or bowed either way? C. Is the top of letter S a point, an eyelet, or an acute angle, or a simple curve? D. To what extent is the spiral elaborated? 20. Examination of small letter T. A. If an initial upstroke is present, examine it as to position of starting point, straightness or line, and angle or slope. B. Examine the rotation of the upstroke and downstroke. C. Examine final stroke in the usual way. D. Examine the crossing as to symmetry, length, and pen emphasis. Number 21. Examination of small letter U. A. Use the same procedure as laid down for small letter I. B. Note also any differences in comparative heights of 2 points. Number 22. Examination of small letter V. A. Examine initial arcade as in the case of small letter M. B. Examine trough or garlands as in the case of small letter E. C. Examine the final horizontal spars in the case of small letter B. Number 23. Examination of small letter W. Examine the same for the small letter U. B. Note any difference in height of the 3 points. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. C. Do bases on both trough rest on baseline. D. Are both through equal in width? with the E. Examine the final stroke. Number 24. Examination of small letter x. A. Examine the formation point of intersection and final stroke. Number 25. Examination of small letter y. Examine initial upstroke in the usual way. B. Examine the symmetry of trough. Does the base lie on, above, or below the baseline? C. Examine the lower point, the lower projection. So, hindi ko na 26. Examination of small letter z. A. Examine the formation, lower projection, loop, etc. Disguised writing. Some anonymous letters are of a friendly nature. Some can even be endearing, such as when a secret admirer sends someone a love letter on Valentine's Day. However, there are also anonymous letters that use deception for less innocent purposes, such as absence letter, vicious threatening complaints, notes from robbers demanding money in bank counters, or even explosive devices sent through the mail. In many of these cases, the writers disguise their handwriting as well as the samples requested from them to comparison purposes. To disguise his handwriting, the writer may attempt to deliberately change the shape of loops or proportions of letters, use writing styles that is unlike his own. A right-handed writer might even use his left hand to create a poorly controlled, untidy, and irregular effect. Another method of disguise is changing the writer method from the writer's usual cursive to block capital letters. As with every other human activity, the ability to disguise varies with the individual. Some people are good altering their writing habits, while others find it nearly impossible to make any appreciable change from their natural method. Some can successfully hide their identity in a small amount of writing, such as single signature. However, most are unable to maintain a disguise when they have to write a large amount of material, such as an entire letter or several exemplar forms. The chances of being identified increases as they continue to write. Hence, the more exemplars are obtained, the greater are the chances that the writings will contain some of the normal characteristics of the writer. One of the best things an investigator can do when taking exemplars is to have some non-requested specimens of the person to compare with the requested specimens. This will enable him to see if there is any obvious differences between these collected specimens and the requested writings. When most persons who are giving a disguised specimen are confronted with a natural written specimen, they will continue to attempt disguise.